Where and when were you born?
I was born in Kenya
Oh,
in 1935 at the hour of 2 a.m.
and
on the
is there,
25th of May.
yeah. So, like me, you're a Gemini. Do you, in any way identify with being a Gemini? Does it mean anything to you?
Oh, I absolutely do, because I have multiple interests and I love them all.
Me too. Anything else that is particularly Gemini?
Um, yes, I'm doing medicine, which is a good Gemini topic,
Why?
because apparently a lot of Geminis like doing medicine. I don't
Oh,
know why.
I think one of our characteristics is we're really curious, and I think to be a good medical professional, you need to be curious. So
Oh, yes.
you're open to new ideas and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that it's opening to new ideas. I'm just putting my sound up.
Okay. What is your birth order?
What's my birth?
Order. Do you have siblings?
Oh yes, my birth order is the third, the last one.
Okay.
Therefore, the freest of the lot.
Yes. The reason I'm asking is that one of the people that I interviewed referred me to a book about rebel scientists where he found that many were later born. But in this particular study of over 50 people, many more are firstborn. But just statistically, there's probably going to be more firstborns than laterborns.
Yes, later born, I would say, allows you to be freer and you're not quite so stuck into grooves.
Right. Have you had a chance to do your Myers-Briggs, Kersey and Bates personality inventory?
Oh, did you send me a personality inventory?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think I may have done that. Trouble is, it was a few days ago and I don't know what happened to it.
Well, it's see if you remember extrovert or introvert.
Sorry, say that again?
Are you an extrovert or an introvert?
Oh, more extroverted than introvert.
Yeah, I agree. And the second category is the most interesting for this study, and that's intuitive or sensing, N or S.
Say that again.
Intuitive or sensing.
Mainly intuitive. I got quite an intuitive streak in me.
Yeah. And the third category is thinking or feeling.
What or feeling?
Thinking. Analytical.
Oh, halfway between them. I like things to be analytical when I look at them, but I'm much more interested in opening up a new area and letting other people do the detailed work on it.
That's Gemini too. The last category is not descriptive. It's called judging or perceiving, but the judging people like structure. They like to check things off their list. If they're really J, they'll put something on their list that they've already done to check it off. And the P people like open options. They don't like to be put in a box.
Yeah, again, I'm halfway between those because there's some things where you have to be structured and there's some things where you can be free.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of balanced on that.
Yeah. You have taught in Japan, obviously in England. Do you find that you teach differently to Japanese students or when you're lecturing in Japan? I've done it and I certainly do it. I find it's different.
I like Japan very much indeed. The cat has come, decided that it wants to come and see us.
This is a common phenomena. It happens often.
Come on then. You're going to come and sit down. Talking to America.
That's great. Japan.
Japan. Now, I like Japan very much. I wouldn't like to be Japanese because they're very rule bound, and they're, as they say, if you are a nail, if you behave as a nail and stick out, they hammer you down, and that's not really my personality. But as a country, they're terrific. As people, they're just lovely. But I wouldn't like to be one.
You know what was really interesting is I met a woman who was living in Los Angeles, and then she moved to Japan and brought me there to teach what clairvoyance and healing. And after being there a couple of years, she kind of turned inward, and she shrunk in a way in terms of her dynamism. It was really interesting, but she had to kind of collapse is too strong a word, but pull inward to cope with being in Japanese culture. So interesting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. For example, just an example of the limitation of freedom. If you say to the people in the lab, will you like to come to lunch? They will say, well, I've just had breakfast, let me ask so-and-so, let me ask so-and-so, let me ask so-and-so. And when there's a group consensus, then we all go to lunch. So, it's just the culture, really. But there are other things where they are enormously helpful and supportive. So it's a mixture.
Oh, yes. I love teaching them because they're so conscientious.
Aren't they?
They would do their work, for sure.
Yes.
What led you to become a physician, a neuropsychiatrist? Tell me about your boyhood and why your parents...
That was very straightforward. My mother was a doctor. She came from Australia. She was a woman surgeon. And she was the first woman surgeon from Melbourne in Australia to go to Edinburgh and get a higher degree. And so medicine was very much what I was going to do. And so I wanted to be a doctor like her. But I was also fascinated by consciousness and the brain, even as a child. I wanted to know more about it. So I thought I'd be a neurosurgeon. But when I was doing my house jobs or internship, I was an intern to a neurosurgeon. And remember, this goes way back into the early 60s. And there weren't any ways of investigating the brain. You just injected air into the spinal column and then x-rayed the brain, and you could see where the air was and the brain wasn't. So CT scans and MRIs hadn't come in or anything like that. So it was very primitive. And I felt that it wasn't my field because you were looking down a dark hole all the time. And then I was very lucky, and I had as one of my mentors, the guy who was leading in Britain at that time, the EEG. And I'd been working at Cambridge with, in my undergraduate days, Adrian was the master of the college, and Andrew Huxley, who got both of those got the Nobel Prizes for electrophysiology. So electrophysiology was very much the sort of thing that I was interested in. Then I found electrophysiology didn't tell you much about mind, so I became a psychiatrist, and that led me to neuropsychiatry.
Mm-hmm. What was your family doing in Kenya?
Sorry?
You were born in Kenya. What was your family doing there?
Kenya was a colony then, and my father was a younger son. And the practice was that younger sons went out into the colonies. So he went out there, and he was a farmer, and he farmed coffee. And it was a great life.
How did your parents meet? If your mother was in Australia and studying in Scotland, and he was in Kenya.
Yeah, you might well ask, but my father went home to see his family, I think after his first wife died, if I remember correctly. And my mother was coming back from a trip where she'd been both working and seeing Canada and places like that, and they met on board the ship going to Kenya. And then they didn't decide very much, but so she sailed on and he caught the next boat to Melbourne and then brought her back to Kenya. And in those days, you couldn't bring a lone girl into Kenya without marrying her. So he married her in Mombasa. I mean, fascinating.
It is. And then did you spend all your childhood in Kenya?
No, not now. Well, of course, my parents are dead, but my brother farmed there and then came back to England when he inherited the family estates in England. And my sister, who was there, came married, and her husband worked for Lonro. And so she came to England too. So we don't have anybody there.
Okay. Do you think that it changed your worldview to be raised in such a different country when you were little?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can tell them they're blue sky children. They like open air and wide open spaces, not like those who are brought up in London.
And I would think that it's also different being a minority, that you have compassion for people who are different because you were different.
In a sense, that's true. But remember, my mother was a surgeon, and during the war, that's the Second World War, she ran a hospital on her own. So she had to teach the staff, and she had to teach the anaesthetists and everything. And so there was a compassionate feel for everybody within the family anyway. Mm-hmm. So that's what rubbed off on me.
Mm-hmm. I wish you'd say a word about psychiatry, because it really seems very odd to me that psychiatry evolved from Freud and Jung, where you would discuss your dreams and understand your unconscious propulsions, to prescriptions. You know, in the U.S., the insurance companies don't want you to spend much time with a patient, and they want you to prescribe. And so I wondered if it's the same in England, if that's the problem.
Oh, it is the same in England, but remember, when I was growing up, there wasn't the drugs about that there are now. So prescription wasn't the end of everything, and talking to your patients and understanding them was enormously important. So it was rather different. But I was also a neuropsychiatrist, so the branch that I took, in fact, was that with neurological illnesses, and the one that I worked most with was epilepsy. So, and epilepsy is a very, very good teacher of brain structure, because you can see where the seizures are going and through what structures.
And then that tells you what part of the brain influences what part of the thinking process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it mimics a lot of psychiatric conditions too, because you get post-ictal psychoses. That means seizures after psychosis after a seizure. They're interesting too, because they have their own characteristics. So it's enormously interesting. So that was interesting.
Is there any pushback among psychiatrists against this emphasis on prescribing drugs, or is it just now it's the new norm?
There is a lot of drug prescribing. and you'd have to really specialize more in psychotherapy if you came away from that. But then you see there are drugs which are good now in the way that they weren't when I was younger. Would I just prescribe drugs? No, because I like talking to people.
All right. This is kind of a footnote, but a real concern in the U.S. is the growing number of teenagers, especially girls, who are anxious and depressed. It's a big upswelling, especially girls. And some people attribute it partly to social media pressure and feeling inadequate. And I wondered if the same kind of problem is true in the UK.
Yes, I think probably when you get any population of adolescents open to the criticism of their peers on a daily basis, or the reinforcement of their peers, then you will get that. So yes, we see the same.
But what's interesting is much more for girls than for boys. What do you think allows boys not to be as reactive?
I think a lot depends really on the fact that girls tend to be more social. Boys don't have best friends like girls do in school. And girls are very sensitive to what their best friend thinks. And so you can extend that really. Whereas boys don't seem to care so much. So it's not surprising in a way.
You know, what's really interesting to me is groups of men, I don't know if older men do this, but younger men, that they play kind of a game where they insult each other. And they think it's really funny. And to see who can insult the other one in the most hurtful way. And if someone did those things to me, I would be crying. But those guys are laughing. So there's something about lad culture that kind of toughens them up.
Yes, I think that's right. But you must remember that on social media, you're in your bedroom with your phone, and somebody posts a message to say they think you're the most revolting thing they've ever come across. And it does tend to hit home if you're that age.
Yes. But then it's kind of a double-edged sword, because boys are taught not to be as emotionally reactive, but then that can inhibit their deep feelings maybe as well. The good feelings, like, bonding and attachment and love and whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is cultural.
Right. And in Japan, I'm thinking that there's not as much difference between boys and girls. I'm not sure. That's kind of a wild statement. What do you think in the way they're socialized?
In the way the boys and girls socialize?
Yeah, in Japan.
Oh, in Japan? Oh,
yeah.
Gosh, yes. Very, very, very different. And what I hold there is two things. One is the Japanese word for wife, kanai, which means deep within. And essentially the woman's place is deep within the home. And you remember that the Japanese parliament, didn't vote that women could have contraception until Viagra came on, and they were passing Viagra for men, and they thought they had to do something about women. I mean, it's really... The other thing is, don't have your baby in Japan. I mean, it may have changed now. I'm talking about sort of 10, 15 years ago. And then pain in childbirth was seen as being very good for the mother. But who were the obstetricians? They weren't women, they were men. And of course they would look and think, yeah, that's going to build you up into a real woman if it hurts. I mean, it's so interesting. It's all cultural.
Right. When you were growing up, what was your family's attitude towards religion and spirituality? Were they Church of England kind of?
Yes, I was brought up Church of England. My mother, I think, was more spiritual. She was more Victorian in this way than my father was. The first time I fainted was when I fainted in church on a hot summer's day and stood up when I was an adolescent. So we went to church occasionally. I mean, I knew what they were. But the real opening spirituality for me was the book by, gosh, what's his name?
Raymond Moody?
No, long before Raymond Moody. It was The Outsiders. And The Outsiders were people who were enormously talented and creative because they could contact a different aspect of consciousness. And the book was full of examples of great mystics, poets, artists, and so on. So the argument was that there was this level that people could have access to, and that was very informative to me.
Roughly how old were you when you read that book?
20.
So you were at university?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people that I've interviewed found meditation really helped them stay centered. Has that been part of your practice?
Now remember that I had an interest in spirituality, and so when the Maharishi came to London, I was interested in meditation because the group that I was with learnt to meditate. So, of course, what I did was take them straight down to the lab and put electrodes on them. This was before anybody else had done it, because they didn't have the subjects. And one of my first papers in '69 was on changes in meditation, and then we published a few more after that. But one of the interesting things which came out of those papers that the Maharishi said the gateway to consciousness is between sleeping and waking. And what we found was that our subjects tended to go to sleep before they started the session. They held themselves between sleeping and waking during the meditation session. And then afterwards, they tended to go back to sleep again. So the Maharishi seems to have been right.
You mean even in the lab with electrodes on their head, they could sleep?
Oh, yes. Good heavens, yes.
I couldn't. Oh, that's interesting. And were you able to do yourself as a subject as well? Some people are talking about self-study as kind of part of this psi research.
Sorry, was that sound?
Were you able to self-study? Where you put electrodes on your mind on your brain when you were meditating?
Well, yeah, it wouldn't have been much help to me because the technology is rather simple at that time. And so any displays we had, it would have taken me out of the meditation. So no, we didn't do that. There's a famous American physiologist called Joe Camille, and he was enormously interested in feedback, particularly in biofeedback. And so we did 1 or 2 studies on biofeedback and increasing alpha activity and all that sort of thing, and showed it worked. One of the most interesting ones was in epilepsy. I felt that epileptic seizures take part in a functioning brain. Therefore, there must be a relationship between brain function and seizures. So if we could tell people about it, it would, they might be able to control their seizures. So what we did was we took spikes, which are the neurological equivalent of the abnormal activity which can lead to a seizure, and gave them the paradigm of increasing spike, of decreasing spikes, and doing nothing. And they showed that they could get control of it. When I showed that to my colleagues, they said, "You've only shown one half of it." Show that they can increase spikes as well. And so I did this with another patient, and she was able to decrease them. Then she found that she could increase them, and this was enormously threatening to her. And she terminated the experiment. And when I asked her why, she said, "Because I have a mechanism that I use all the time to control my seizures. And by increasing the spikes, I was taking that mechanism away." So it was really a very good way of proving that there was, in fact, a relationship between mind and the occurrence of seizure. It's interesting.
Was there a particular technique that worked, like deep breathing, or was it just setting the intent, I want the spike to lower, that worked?
What I did was we gave her a counter, and every time a spike occurred, I detected the spike, the counter notched up. And so what she had to do was stop the counter notching.
With her intention?
With her intention. And what was really interesting is a lot of my colleagues didn't like that, because they said, well, you make your patients feel very guilty. But by handing control over to the patients, of course, you did exactly the opposite. I mean, they were delighted if they had something which they thought they could use to decrease seizures.
Right. That makes perfect sense. We better do some definitions. What is consciousness? There's a lot of debate about that.
What is consciousness?
What's mind and what's brain?
You just have to accept that there are two belief structures. One belief structure is that everything is brain. There's nothing else. In other words, it's all material. There's nothing else beyond materialism, and the whole of our perceived world is just a video, if you like, created for us by the brain, and there's an end to it. So that leads to a really very uncaring society, and it leads to the way that one can damage the world around us because it's only material. And the other one, of course, is that our consciousness is much wider than that, sort of idealism and panpsychism and consciousness being in everything and created by everything seems to me to be a much better one. And I very much like Maslow's idea of filters. In other words, the brain puts on filters, and so you see more or less. Now, I think this is true because I think you can alter what you see. And with the work which I've done on death, I don't think there's any doubt at all, and through near-death experiences, but not so much that through death, that consciousness is something which is quite different from brain function. I quite like Ian McGilchrist. Ian McGilchrist was a neuropsychiatrist, and I worked with him for some time. He published a very famous book, Master in His Emissary, Right and Left Hemispheres of the Brain. And at a conference, I was able to ask him recently what he thought consciousness was, just like you're asking me, and I quite liked his answer. And his answer was this, that think of a stream, which in fact is the raw material of consciousness, and then think of a rock in it. It creates ripples. The ripples, in fact, reflect in some way the structure of the rock, but of course are not the rock in any sense, because it's the way the stream interacts with the rock. And so he uses that as a model for consciousness, and the brain, in fact, is the rock in the stream, which is structuring consciousness. I think it's quite a nice, pretty image.
I do too. And then is mind synonymous with consciousness?
Let's take it like that. Otherwise, you get into difficult discussions of where brain ends, where mind begins, where mind ends, where consciousness begins. And they're not fruitful discussions because we don't have enough in the way of an understanding of it to be able to say. I mean, the brain correlates are enormously powerful. But since when has a correlate been causative? And I still like the story that was told about the Second World War. After the Second World War in Germany, there was a baby boom, which you see in countries after the war, and their population went up. During that period, the weather was much sunnier, and so the stork population grew. So if you correlate baby births with stork population, it's very high. And it's just a very nice idea of the relationship between a correlate and a causative factor.
Right. There seems to be a growing movement, we could say, of scientists who are critical of the materialist paradigm and advocating a non-materialist paradigm. Where do you think we are historically in that push for a paradigm of consciousness rather than materialism in the scientific community?
I think that one is being sorted out now, because there are many experiments which show that brain beyond the brain is in fact a fact. It's just an empirical fact because you've got very good experiments. Now, I haven't yet been in a discussion with somebody who says that that view is rubbish and has read the literature. Usually they haven't read the literature.
Right.
And in fact, in one discussion I had, they were saying, why should I bother to read the literature? It's all done badly. And of course, what is turning out now is that many of the parapsychologists are much more accurate than some of the psychologists and get much better results, repeatable results. So I think it's interesting.
Right. Some people look at transpersonal psychiatry, psychology as kind of an intermediate in a way between psi and more traditional approaches. Do you think that that's something worth looking at, transpersonal psychology?
We don't have any option because it's there. There are very, very wide experiences which people have. And so, yes, we study them. And in actual fact, what's so thrilling now is there is a lot of data being gathered, particularly by one of your colleagues in America, Jeffrey Martin, where he has understood or is getting towards the understanding of these very wide mental states that many of the religious leaders of the past have had. And it seems as if that sitting on a golden throne is, of course, not what it's about. It's about the hard work you do before that when you're in the forests, etc. That's come now into science. Says that he's getting about 70% of people going to this altered state of consciousness, which he calls permanent non-symbolic experience. And that's really very exciting because it means that I think it's on the evolutionary ladder, and I think that something which our current culture is very much pointing towards. So I think, I think that things are changing.
I still run into a lot of people who associate some kind of premonition or some kind of insight as frightening, or they think people will think they're crazy. So I think there's still a lot of pressure in the West that anything that you can't explain with your materialist senses is crazy.
I think that unfortunately is true. And in one field that I've done some work, which is the field of the dying, deathbed experiences and deathbed visitors and so on are the common currency of the dying. And to have a deathbed visitor and the nurse to come, let's say it's your mum who says she's come to collect you, and the nurse says, well, that's just the morphine talking, don't just ignore it, means they have removed from that person a huge area of help and comfort and loving kindness. You know, it's ridiculous because these experiences are there, and okay, they don't fit a material frame. Well, so what? Frame's wrong.
Something like quantum physics, that Einstein said, you know, spooky action from a distance, all the quantum weirdness, that should open up the scientific community to the idea that just because something seems odd, it doesn't mean it's not real.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean, since quantum mechanics came in, and we know that we're all connected to each other, that every particle in the universe affects every other particle, how can we be separate?
Right.
Really interesting.
It's very tempting, and I know physicists don't like this, but it's tempting to say quantum entanglement, where entangled particles influence each other at a distance, whatever the mechanism that allows for that kind of efficacy or communication, that could explain clairvoyance, healing from a distance, all kinds of psi phenomena. But physicists don't like to go there. What's your thinking about using quantum mechanics to explain psi phenomena?
Well, you can certainly do that. I don't have the technical expertise to be able to support or not support it. It seems a nice story to me. I like it very much. And since we're always interested in telling ourselves stories, a quantum story seems to me to be a good one and sensible.
Right. One more thing about quantum physics that I think is really key for the science understanding is that the observer or measurement changes the state of that which is being measured. So we can't say that there's objective reality. It's all the interaction between you and me and what's going on. Do you think that science has really come to grips with the measurement effect, the observer effect?
No, I don't. But you see it at different levels. For example, there's a nice study which has just come out, which has shown that 40 seconds of compassionate care for somebody alters the function of their immune system and their rate of healing. So the relationship between people reflects what you're talking about as well. So it's at all different levels, and the degree of our sensitivity to compassion and care and kindness from other people is enormously sensitive, and so the movement of the culture in that direction, I think, is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Do you think with the expansion of artificial intelligence that you could have a robot that kind of was dedicated to the bedside of a patient, say, how are you feeling? Oh, it sounds like you're feeling da-da-da. Oh, I really care about... Do you think that's a possibility? Or does compassion have to be kind kind of a vibrational heart-to-heart felt?
Do not know the answer to that, and I think it's the most interesting question. You saw my cat earlier on, and I think a catbot is something which will be in all our houses soon, because they could make them very mechanical and teach them what to do. So, I mean, do the artificial intelligence, so they do the sort of things that cats do.
Like purr.
Very strokeable.
Yeah.
Purr for you.
That's a good idea. They should have those in nursing homes, cat bots, and they would purr and go and be really soft and cuddly. That's a good idea. We could make a lot of money. I love it. Okay, so let's get more specific into your work with NDEs. You said that your interest was sparked by Raymond Moody's book, but you thought, oh, that's really a California phenomenon. But then you realized, no, it wasn't just a California crazy thing.
Yeah, when I got a patient who came into my consulting rooms who had a cardiac catheter go wrong, he'd lost consciousness, left his body, watched the people trying to resuscitate him, went down the tunnel, and had a full-blown near-death experience. So, I mean, I couldn't any longer say this was only California, because there was one just looking at me and talking to me. So it was obviously there. Then, of course, I became interested in it because it's got a lot to say about this and the nature of the experience and so on. So I decided that I'd study it.
What's interesting is that Kubler-Ross in Los Angeles, patients talked to her or she paid attention to them, whereas other doctors didn't hear the accounts. So there's something about if the physicians think, oh, this is just some kind of hallucination or crazy thing, I don't even want to hear it, then they don't hear it. So it takes a special physician to be open to respecting the patient's experience, so they'll talk about it.
Yes, Pim van Lommel tells a lovely story there. He is a cardiologist and he studied NDEs, and he was giving a lecture and was saying how common they are. And there's one of his physician colleagues who were there. And this physician colleague got up and said, "You say these things are very common, but in my experience, I haven't seen one." To which a patient got up and said, "I've had them, but you're the last person I'd tell."
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of that, in fact.
Absolutely. But now they're more common because of ability to resuscitate people after a heart attack and that kind of thing. So are you hearing that the medical profession is more open to considering there could be such a thing as NDEs?
No, I think that may be true, but in our series of 500, only 10% were due to cardiac damage or due to cardiac problems. The rest weren't. So that's 90% weren't due to cardiac causes. The only reason we studied cardiac causes because you can actually know what state the brain is in. If there's no blood flowing through it, obviously you will, in a few seconds, you will lose consciousness, and then you'll get irreversible damage and not survive. So we could tell what state the brain was in, but the 90% of people with near-death experiences who have it for different reasons. For example, during birth, and then there are the fear states that they get, the fear experiences. So there are many other experiences which can lead to a near-death experience, and it doesn't have to be cardiac. So the idea that the brain has to be switched off for it to occur is not true. It's there in many different forms. The thing is that when you see these things en masse, you come to realize that the variance of the various phenomena is very wide. For example, going through the tunnel. Well, some people never have a tunnel; they just float through space, and so on and so on. So it's got multiple aspects to it. Well, although it's nice to think of it as it is, I'm not sure it's absolutely like that.
I read that you found in Japan, excuse me, that they use the image of caves, not tunnels.
Yes,
that was so
fascinating. crossing a river with a boat, but that's cultural.
Well, you said the crossing the river with the boat is hunters and gatherers. How in the world does one interview hunter-gatherers about NDEs?
Well, that's only one aspect of an NDE. You can say, did you go down a tunnel? No, I got into a boat and crossed the river. Oh, that's interesting. Then what happened? Then the being of light, and so it goes on. So it's only one aspect of it. So yes, there are cultural effects, but there are an awful lot which aren't, which are cross-cultural.
Which is the being of light, met by relatives and friends, review of life. What else? That are pretty uniform.
Yes, don't think of them as uniform because they are and they aren't. As I say, and some of the most profound ones that I've had repeated to me, people have been floating through space, empty space, moving towards the ultimate in love, which is quite often related to light as well. And they seem to have short-circuited, if you like, the rather lower level ones, which are structured in form. These ones aren't structured in form. They're structured intensely in feeling, but not in form. So you have to understand exactly what the nature of the experience is that the people are having. They're not. You can say to some, "Did you go down a tunnel?" And they say, "Yeah." Being of light, yeah. Into an English country garden, not an American country garden. No, it's an English country garden. Yeah. Meet your relatives, yeah. They sent you home? No, I decided to come home. Okay. And you've got the lock there. But it varies.
Well, I'm thinking of Robert Monroe's book where he then started teaching people to astral travel, and he and I think his students would have very similar experiences of accessing love and different dimensions. So I see your point that you don't have to have a dead brain to have these transcendent experiences.
Absolutely. They're all within the repertoire of human experience. And then you come back to your initial question. One always comes back to this at the end. Is it brain function only, or is consciousness something wider?
What works for me is the idea. Oh wait, I have to show you my cat. Come here, come here. Do you see it?
Yeah. Oh, look, a cat bot. It's lovely.
So she distracted me. So I like the image of the filter that something like psychedelic drugs or death of the brain, some kind of assault to the brain, it cuts off our normal filtering devices, so then we have access to the broader world of consciousness. Do you think that works?
I think it works very nicely.
Yeah.
It works excellently.
Have you had those kind of transcendent experiences yourself?
Yeah, I've had some transcendent experiences. You can't be in the field and not have them.
And what were the what was the catalyst for them?
I think some of the most profound ones were after I'd done longish periods of meditation and then gone on a retreat. And then I got some very wide experiences.
Where you experienced that deep sense of love and oneness?
Oh yes, I mean your perceptual field is totally different.
So I'm assuming that your wife, who is your co-author in books like The Truth and the Light, obviously shares your interest in this field.
Yes, she's a very lovely wife.
How wonderful.
And she's very good at English too.
Good.
So she writes them and I dictate them and then she puts them into English.
Fabulous. And may I ask how long you've been married?
Yeah. 50 years, I think, something like that.
And how do you keep from being bored and taking each other for granted?
Oh, you couldn't be bored with that woman. She's astonishingly lively.
How wonderful. You are lucky.
Yeah, very lucky.
Well, some people say that you have to work at making a relationship work and you have to take time to talk through issues. Do you have any advice for people?
Yes, we're playful with each other. And this is one of the secrets. If you're playful with the other person, then it's always amusing and it's fun and, it's just nice.
Mm-hmm. And did you have time to have children along the way?
Yeah, 3.
And
2 girls and a boy.
And did they go into science fields or not?
No, they're really fascinating. The first one identified with me and has gone into psychology. The second one has identified with my wife and has gone into writing children's books.
Oh.
And the third one has got a little bit of both of us. And interestingly enough, he's working in Japan and he's got his own business there. So he's a business person.
Very interesting. So let's just kind of summarize your books. The Truth and the Light, 1996. You tapped into a resource when you did a TV show, and then 500 people or so wrote to you, and then you culled
2000.
2000.
We got 2,000 letters.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever opened 2,000 letters?
Wow. That was a 2-person job for sure.
Oh, it certainly is. Then
And
you have to read 2,000 letters, then reply to them.
oh, wow. What I was surprised with that is that only 12% reported life reviews, because life reviews seems like it's such a pivotal point of the whole thing as to what did I learn, where did I fall short. It seems so crucial.
Sorry, only 12% what?
Life reviews.
Oh, life review. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you usually think the life review is something which everybody has, they don't. And what I've learned since then is that people may have had life reviews and haven't seen it as such. You know, they came back from their experience with detailed information about the way their previous lives had affected them. So I think that probably is within the life review. So again, I want to sort of break the stereotype. Yeah, some people have a life review, but some people have a sort of life review. They're different, although the same thing.
And one of the things that was interesting to me is that the only animals that appeared in those NDEs that you reported on were dogs. I mean, we have our cats. Are our cats not going to be there with us?
Yes, I think that's enormously interesting. I mean, you can take this into the death field because it seems now that most people are collected by a dead relative who comes to pick them up, or that's what they report. Whether the dead relative is there or not, or it's just in their imagination, is not a question which is relevant, in fact. What is relevant is to support what the person is experiencing, that they're not mad. And so how many people have their dogs or cats come to pick them up? They're very rare. We've had one or two, but not many.
But have you had cats ever?
What?
Have you ever had cats?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Have you ever had cats that were part of the NDE that were on the other side?
Yes, but again, it's rare. It's all rare.
Let's
Although
see.
Yeah, okay.
It's interesting that children have them because they're clearly not programmed. So when children have these kind of psi experiences, like Stevenson's work on remembering past lives, it seems we really need to pay attention since they haven't been programmed in the same way.
Yeah, it could be.
Let's see what else. You mentioned the drug ketamine. How does that work? So should everyone take ketamine to have a blissful spiritual experience?
No, they don't. It's like everything else. An NDA receptor, is this involved? Yes, it probably is. But to what extent? Some people get very bad trips on ketamine. Other people get better trips. And they're also different. So drugs are different. But one wouldn't be surprised with this because people respond differently to different drugs just in their physical makeup, let alone in their psychological makeup. So yes, you see, now we're coming to a really interesting area. Are the structures in the brain which predisposes A, to near-death experiences, or B, predisposes to mystical experiences as a whole? Now, I'm sure there are. But since we don't actually know what an experience is, to try and attribute it to one of the major theories is difficult. I think the materialist hypothesis probably is less explanatory than the brain as a filter theory. So I prefer brain as a filter theories just because I think that they explain more of the data. But we never know. We don't know.
But the way psychedelic drugs work is they reduce filter or because they don't particularly impact one part of the brain or another, right? I mean, you can't pinpoint where a psychedelic drug would influence a reaction.
Yes, you can sort of,
Oh.
but the type of reaction you get is obviously going to depend on the person. There's some interesting books written. There's a guy whose name I can't remember at the moment, but he took LSD weekly for a long period of time, so he got to know the LSD experience extremely well. And he gives a very nice categorization of levels of consciousness, which is very similar to what some of the more esoteric descriptions from Eastern religions give. So, there's going to be a tie-up there. Well, how can there possibly be a tie-up if he hasn't been exposed to it? Let's assume he hadn't. Then you have to argue that there is, in fact, an experiential world which is common to all of us that he had access to. I don't see that that's too fantastic at all.
No. In the hidden doors, you focused on understanding and controlling dreams. Does that mean lucid dreaming?
Um, yes, that's right. That was an interesting phase that I was going through at that time. In fact, how much could one control one's dreams? And it was brought about because I was told the story by a barrister who was very frightened, and at night he would he would walk into a forest, and then into a clearing, and then the bushes on the other side of the clearing would wiggle, and out of it would come a wild pig, which is determined to get him. The dream would end with him running away, but of course not doing it terribly effectively. So my teaching of him was to face it. So in your dream, in the height of your terror, when you see the bushes move and the pig come out, just stand there and tell me what the result is. The result was an interesting one. He said, well, the pig came towards me and I remembered what you'd said in my dream. And the pig then turned into a little suckling pig, went between my legs and disappeared. And with the disappearance of the pig was the end of his dreams. So in fact, he got dream control. And this was the time when people were interested in lucid dreams. And we did some work on lucid dreams as well. And again, they're enormously interesting. But dream control, yes, was interesting to me then.
Mm-hmm. And have you experienced prophetic dreams?
I haven't had a prophetic dream myself, but we, of course, got accounts from people of prophetic dreams. Some of them easily explicable. One of them was a man who was riding a horse, and he came out of a forest, and there were tigers, and the tigers were out to kill him. And he turned around to see the tigers gaining on him. And when he turned back, there were men in white coats around him shooing the tigers away, but one of them was malignant and caught him in the back with its claw. And he then woke up with them being chased away, and he then got his wife to look in his back, and sure enough, there was the beginning of a lesion there. And when he went to his GP, yes, it was a melanoma, and it was removed, and he was okay. So there's a very nice prophetic dream. And I quite like that one, but you just argue that the cancer had started, there were sensory changes, and that came up in his dream, closed in a nice story, which is a lovely one. But I think one of my favorites is Legal Eagle. And this was a man who was fascinated by racing, loved racing, and he was going up to Aintree in England, where we run the Grand National, or where it's run. And he was going up the next day to Aintree, and he knew that he had to have a dream which would give him the winner. And so when he woke up, he knew he'd been seen in his dream that the winner was called Legal Eagle. So he rushed down to the newspapers and looked at the field, and there's no Legal Eagle. And so he just thought it was pointless. And he drove up to Aintree, and on the radio there was a program which was run by a lawyer who was called Legal Eagle. It was a legal program. And while he was listening to it, Legal Eagle and his team had each drawn horses in the Grand National. And the horse that Legal Eagle had drawn was Red Rum, and Red Rum turned out to be a winner of the National over a number of years. But this was before he'd done it. And so the man said, well, obviously Legal Eagle and Red Rum are linked, so that's what I will I'll bet. Now there's a remote thing. How on earth are you going to explain that? I don't think you can, except on a sort of interconnection theory, but a materialist theory of brain and REM rhythms and so on isn't going to produce a nice story like that.
Did that horse win?
Yeah, absolutely. He got a lot of money on it. And remember, these are all stories which have been sent to me, but they've made them up or not, I don't know. But I don't think so. I mean, it sounded very, very authentic.
When I was in my 20s, I would used to get these little, they weren't dreams, but they were like little snapshots, little visions of things that would happen or people that I would meet. And they were really accurate. But it wasn't in a dream state. It was kind of in between.
Yeah, in the hypnagogic phase, you mean? Between waking and sleeping.
Kind of, yeah. In Past Lives that you wrote in 1999, where was your resource? Where did you gather information about people's past life memories?
Past life memories, that book was written mainly by reviewing the field and what other people have done. We didn't have a big source of people with past life memories because, of course, at that time Stevenson was doing the research on that and produced his book of 2,000 past life memories. So they were around, if you like, and one of the questions was, how are you going to understand past life memories? Are they really past life memories, or are they people making them up in India and wanting money for their past life memories, which is one of the usual ways of understanding them. But in fact, I think Stevenson's data was absolutely excellent. And then one went back through the data. I mean, 2,000 cases is a lot of cases. And anybody who says they don't believe in past life memories need to study his work. Now, of course, I think it's Tucker who's taken on the role from Stevenson.
Jim Tucker.
Yeah, that's right. And he's got a lot of American stories which are really interesting. So, yeah, they're there. And so we again have a different sort of world than just a materialistic world, because it looks as if information is carried over, and I think it's interesting.
Oh, it's fascinating. Do you have any sense of any of your past lives?
Me?
Yes.
No, I'd love to have a really good past life experience. In fact, I should have done it because going through past life regressions was all the phase about 10, 15 years ago. And I just never got round to it. But a lot of my friends did, and they all came back swearing, yeah, this was my past life, and this is how I was killed, and this is what it was like. I don't know, but I never experienced it myself.
It's interesting that Raymond Moody in one of his books describes 9 of his past lives, and I think he made the point they were very innocuous, humble. You know, he wasn't Cleopatra or something that makes it more understandable if you're not someone famous.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
And The Art of Dying, is that your most recent book? 2008?
Yes. Yeah.
And
no, it's not. The most recent one hasn't been published yet. But this is the most recent published one. Yeah.
And did you find that, like, the Tibetan Book of the Dead was a useful guide?
It was an interesting guide. It's a very fearful guide. And the data that's coming out now is that the death process is not fearful.
No, it's blissful.
The only person who makes it fearful is you. And with the recent work which has come out of Switzerland, there's no doubt that death, in fact, is an expansion of consciousness. Now, that's a very strange thing to say. Nobody will, if they're materialists, will say that's ridiculous. Or they could, I think, probably get that by saying, well, there are parts of the brain just before they die they give the impression of expansion. But the idea of expansion has come from the work of Monica Rent, and she argues that the first stage is clearing and giving up your attachments. The second stage is sort of resting phase, and then you go into non-duality. And non-duality is a level of consciousness where the ego has gone and left with background consciousness, which is some of the states that Jeffrey Martin has been inducing or helping people to find in themselves through his Finders courses. So in that case, if you're going non-dual before you die, that's a huge expansion. That's an expansion of consciousness, not a reduction of consciousness. That's the data.
And that fits in with the filter theory, because when you're dying, the filter drops off.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. That would be the argument.
Yes. So what book are you working on now, you and your productive wife?
My authoress wife. It's a book on a man who can show light when he meditates, and that interested me. And so I've been looking at him and seeing consciousness, which you can feel when he's meditating, and what the mechanism is behind.
So when he goes into meditation, he has like an aura that you can see of light?
No, it's not like that. It's different. It's like an emanation from him rather than just being the standard aura. Although some people do see it as the form of an aura, but it's not common. In other words, there are many different ways of seeing it.
Some people, that like at the Rhine Institute, are studying biophotons. Is that the same kind of thing, maybe?
That's so interesting. I can tell you that if it is biophotons, they don't knock the electrons out of photosensitive material like you get in the backing of a digital camera, because you can't see anything with a digital camera. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that probably I'd be better using either infrared or ultraviolet film when I might see something. So I'll do that, but I haven't done that experiment yet. But the experiments we have done are looking at his linkage with his students when he's giving light. And this shows that some frequencies of his brain seem to be controlling the student's brain. Some frequencies in the student's brain seem to be controlling or related to his brain. So they're causative factors which seem to be working in the other person, which are interesting.
Would synchronizing be an accurate word? Their brainwaves synchronize?
It's more than that. You can show that the activity in one brain is going to predict accurately, better than the past history of the activity in another part of the other person's brain. So in fact, it's got a causative relationship. So as the synchronization, it's much more causative.
So if he goes into like theta wave, then you can predict that his students will follow. You can like a particular brainwave pattern.
That's right. That's the idea.
And is he in Britain, or is he like an Indian guru, or?
And is he sitting on the golden throne? And does he hold his hands up and say blessings to you when you go into the room? No, he's a very he's a Frenchman. He's a very down-to-earth Frenchman who gave up his French nationality because he doesn't really like the French, and took on Italian nationality. And he lives in Monaco. He's a trust fund kid and spent a lot of time in cathedrals meditating.
And does he always emanate, or is he just when he's in meditation?
Only when he's in meditation.
Very interesting. And is there another book that you're thinking of beyond that one?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
It's enough.
um, as a person who's accomplished so much, what do you do for fun?
Say that again.
As a person who's accomplished so much, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Oh, well, play usually. um, I was very lucky because when I was 17, the RAF were offering pilot's licenses to people if they wanted to learn to fly. And the reason for that is, remember, we'd just come out of the Second World War, and one of the things that saved us was, in fact, the RAF. And so if there was a large base of people who could fly in the country, that might help in the next World War. I mean, it's sort of old thinking, but it was very nice because I got a scholarship and was taught to fly. And so a lot of my life I've borrowed my friends' planes and so on and flown around. That's been great fun.
What else do you think you attribute being in your 80s that and full of vim and vigor and productivity? Why do you have a good diet? Do you have a good attitude? What are some of the techniques you would recommend to other people who want to be like you?
What I recommend to them is really just study your subject and see if the explanations which you're given fit the data or not. Because what I was finding all the time was that the explanations that I was given for the findings didn't fit them. And so one then looks around for a different theory to explain the data you find. So I think that's the most important thing. The other thing is that if you're interested in consciousness, then there are now many methods that you can use to expand your consciousness. And so there have always been technologies to do this. I mean, you've got the technologies of Buddhist methods of meditation, you've got the Zen methods of brain watching, all these sorts of things. They're old technologies, they're new technologies coming online. It's worth having a look at those and then seeing if you can understand what's happening, both in the brain and in brain's relationship to a field of consciousness, which is what I think it is.
Mm. Let me ask you, in the face of growing inequality, increasing despotic leaders like Trump and the president of Brazil, climate change, global warming, are you optimistic or pessimistic in the face of these challenges?
Sorry, you'll have to say that again because it broke up.
Okay. In the face of climate change, growing inequality, increasing populism of the negative kind, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'd answer that, I think, at two levels. One would be an ordinary level, and that is that with what's happening, one can only really take up a pessimistic viewpoint because I can't see us as a species, in fact, coming together in the way that's be required to halt climate change if the scientists are correct. So that's at one level. But at another level, I'm noticing something else, and that is that there is a huge change in the spiritual understanding of a lot of youth in a way that it certainly wasn't. And what we're talking about now is an evolution of consciousness. And with people starting to, with there being methods, which are very simple methods of how to which allows consciousness to be expanded, I think that will be the other road, and that we will get many more people with expanded consciousness, and this will then result in a different direction of humanity. But those are the two lines.
By simple methods, do you mean meditation, breathing? What do you mean by simple?
Well, I was thinking, first of all, of Jeffrey Martin's classification of consciousness and the changes that he's produced in people on his Finders course as they flip into levels of consciousness. And it's quite fascinating. Now, if that became general, then one would have a very different outlook on the world, and the world would change. So it goes back to the old saying, if you want to change the world, change yourself first.
Mm-hmm. And also, if more people understood that there are consequences of their actions even after their death, then that might change things as well.
Yes, it might, because we've got a lot of grandchildren, and with the way that things are going, they're not going to have a nice life in 20 years' time when they're starting to bring up their own children. So yes, I think it will.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think should be included that it has escaped us?
No, I think the main thing is to keep it light, have fun, be kind, and help others. I think this is basically what it's all about.
Right, and to bring it back to death and rebirth, karma and reincarnation says that we reap what we sow.
Absolutely, and it's worth remembering that, but you can see that in this life anyway.
Yes.
Don't have to wait for a rebirth.
Yes, absolutely. And then last question is, are there people that you think should be in the book that that I haven't interviewed? You mentioned Jeffrey Martin. I'll look up him.
Oh yes, you've got to interview him. Yes, I'm sure there are, but I think I can probably do that better on an email.
Yes, good. Okay. Is Jeffrey Martin, where does he have a university?
California, where you are.
Oh my goodness. Is he at Davis? UC Davis?
No, I don't think he's Davis. Why don't you put Jeffrey Martin into Google and they'll tell you immediately.
Okay. All right.